Hi everyone, welcome back to Level Up and welcome back to the chapter French Revolution. This is part 3 of this chapter and we will be finishing off this chapter in today's video. So for part 1 and part 2 have already been uploaded on our channel, so make sure to check that out just to clear any misconceptions you have about previously covered topics. Anyways, moving ahead, let's take a look at what portions we'll be covering today. Today we'll be covering two main subtopics. The first one is how France abolished monarchy and became a republic. And under the subtopic, we'll be taking a look at the Reign of Terror and also how a directory started ruling France. Okay, so now let's take a look at why France abolished monarchy and what was the situation behind it. But before we get into that, I think we need to revisit a few topics or a little something that we learned in the previous two videos. So in the last two videos, we learned that on the night of 4th August 1789, the National Assembly passed a decree abolishing the entire system, the entire feudal system of obligations, privileges, and taxes. And also, now the king was kept in check by the constitution of the 1791. So now moving on to this slide and what's written on this slide, there is a slight plot twist. So although Louis XVI, the king of France, had signed the constitution, he entered into secret negotiations with the king of Prussia. Now you might ask, why was the king of Prussia willing to help the king of France, especially in times of this? Why getting into something that's really a very meddlesome affair? So the reason for this is Prussia is very close to France geographically. Now, anything that happens in France will obviously be known to the citizens of Prussia and all neighboring countries actually. So if there is a revolution in France, there might also be a possible revolution in Prussia for the very same reasons, abolishing monarchy and establishing democracy or having a constitution or something like that. And in order to oppress a revolution that had not even taken place, the king of Prussia agreed to enter into secret negotiations with the king of France. So now all these kings together of these neighboring countries of France, they made plans to send troops to put down the events that have been taking place there since the summer of 1789, which is since the event of the storming of the Bastille. But before this could happen, the National Assembly already had a notion that this could take place. They voted in April 1792 to declare war against Austria and Prussia, and France won this war. But during this war, during this revolutionary war, a lot of people had, or let's say a lot of nationalistic sentiments were born among the citizens of France, and there was something called Marseillaise, which is now the national anthem of France. It was composed by the poet Roger de L'Isle, and it was sung for the first time by the volunteers during this war as they marched into Paris. And that's why it got its name, because they marched into Marseilles, which is a place in Paris. So as we can see, number one, from this incident, a lot of nationalistic sentiments were born. People started becoming more united against a common enemy, which was the king and the monarch. But although the war was successful in the fact that they were able to throw off the kings, the Revolutionary War also brought a lot of losses and economic difficulties to the citizens, the layman people in France. Because while the men were fighting away at the front, like during the war, the women were left with the task of taking care of the entire family and earning an income. However, even though these difficulties were faced, majority of the population were convinced that the revolution still had to go on and take place because the Constitution of 1791 still only gave political rights to the richer section of society, the propertied people of the society, and they wanted political rights to be entitled by all members of the society. And that brings us to the point of political clubs. Now, political clubs became a very important rallying point for people who wish to discuss government policies or just simply plan their own forms of action. And there were a lot of such clubs in and around France, but the most successful, the most popular among the citizens was that of the Jacobins. They got their name from the former convent of Saint Jacob in Paris. And the people who comprised this club, the members of this club, were primarily those who belonged to the less prosperous section of society. So people like peasants, artisans, watchmakers, daily wage workers, laborers, and such. And their leader was Maximilien Robespierre. Please keep this name in mind. It's very important. It could be also asked as a one-mark question. And now moving on, a large group of these people, the people who were part of the Jacobins Club, they decided to start wearing also uniform clothes. So they all started wearing long striped trousers that were similar to dock workers, and this was primarily to set themselves apart from the fashionable section of society, especially the nobles. So people who had or just people who belonged to a higher class, they usually wore something called knee breeches. So these people didn't wear knee breeches, obviously, because they wanted to set themselves apart. So these Jacobins also came to be known as sans-culottes. Please keep this name in mind as well. It's very important. Sans means without, and culottes means knee breeches. So literally, it meant those without knee breeches. And these members also wore red caps, which symbolize liberty. And also, please keep in mind that women, again, were still not part of the revolution. They still weren't a very important part or weren't contributing as much. Continuing with the Jacobins, in the summer of 1792, the Jacobins had planned an insurrection of a large number of Parisians who were angered by the very short supplies of food, but at the same time, very high prices of food. So, on the morning of 10th August, they stormed into the Palace of Tuileries, which is the king's palace, and massacred the king's guards and held the king himself as hostage for several hours. So, you can just imagine the power that these Jacobins held, the amount of people who were members of this club, because the king would, he's a king, he would obviously have had such a high security, and to overthrow those king's entire, all his guards, all his bodyguards and his entire security, and keep himself, the king himself, as hostage, they must have been very powerful. And later, this assembly voted to imprison the entire royal family. Elections were held, and from now on, all men of 21 years and above, regardless of their wealth, whether they had property or not, had the right to vote. And this newly elected assembly was called the convention. So, just a small recap, the previously elected assembly was called the National Assembly. And after there was an amendment to the constitution, the newly elected assembly was called the convention. And on 21st September 1792, please keep this date in mind, extremely important, it abolished the monarchy and declared France a republic. For those of you who don't know what a republic is a form of government where the people elect the government, including the head of the government. So something like a democracy. But Louis XVI was sentenced to death by the court on the charge of treason. For those of you all who don't know what treason is, it means betrayal of one's own government. And he was charged with this with treason because he got into secret negotiations with the King of Prussia. So obviously betraying his own people, his own citizens. And on 21st January 1793, again keep this date in mind, extremely important, he was publicly executed at the Place de la Concorde, and his queen, Maid Antoinette, who also met with the same fate shortly. Now moving on to a very, very, very important subtopic, the Reign of Terror. The period from 1793 to 1794 is referred to as the Reign of Terror in all of France's history books. Now, Robespierre, for those of y'all who forgot, Maximilien Robespierre was the leader of the Jacobins Club. He followed a very, like a policy of severe control and punishment. And everyone who he saw as enemies of the Republic, ex-nobles, clergy, members of other political parties, and even members of his own party who didn't agree with his methods or his ideas, were arrested, imprisoned, and then tried by a revolutionary tribunal. So if this revolutionary tribunal, aka the court, found them guilty, they were guillotined. So for those of y'all who don't know what the guillotine is, it's a device consisting of two poles and a blade with which a person is beheaded. And what you see on the left is a picture of the guillotine. Now let's take a look at how Robespierre followed his policy and what exactly his policies were. Whatever I'm going to say now, please make sure to learn them as points because it is pretty important. It could be asked as what or how did Robespierre bring changes to the government? And this could be a 3-mark or a 4-mark question. So keep these points in mind and learn them as points. So the first point is Robespierre's government issued laws placing a maximum ceiling on wages and prices, which basically meant that now there was a limit to how much the price of a commodity could be raised. Also, meat and bread were rationed. Peasants were forced to transport their grain to cities and sell them at prices fixed by the government. The use of more expensive white flour was forbidden, and everyone was expected and only allowed to consume the same bread, which was a loaf made of whole wheat. Keep the name of the bread in mind, it is equality bread in French. Equality was also sought in and sought to be practiced through forms of speech and address. So instead of addressing people with the traditional manner, which is monsieur and madame, now everyone was addressed as citizens in French. churches were shut down and they were converted into barracks or offices. And the person you can see on the left is Maximilian Robespierre. Also, with that being said, I just want to tell all of y'all that all pictures, all cartoons, all those purple and those yellow boxes in the textbook, please make sure to go through them. Don't overlook them because they could be asked as 1 mark or 2 mark questions. And you could these are ways you can easily score your marks. And by just not going through them or just like briefly going through them and not being concentrated or like going through them with concentration, you might lose out marks in very stupid ways. So yeah, make sure to do that, please. Now moving on to Maximilian Robespierre as a whole, and what exactly happened to him after he changed the government in so many ways. Robespierre pursued his policies so relentlessly that even his supporters, members of his own party, began to demand moderation and wished for him to be taken down. So finally, he was convicted by a court in July 1794, and he was arrested. And on the very next day, he was sent to the guillotine, which was his own device, his own instrument. And what you can see here on the right is a painting depicting him being sent to the guillotine. Moving on to our next topic, how a directory started ruling France. Now, the fall of the Jacobin government, because the leader was dead, allowed the wealthy middle classes to seize power. So a new constitution was introduced, and this constitution denied the right to denied the right to vote to non-property sections of society. It provided for two elected legislative councils. These legislative councils then appointed a directory. So an executive was made up of 5 members. This was meant as a safeguard against the constitutional power in a one-man executive, as it was under the Jacobins. However, these directors often clashed with the legislative councils, and this political instability paved the way for the rise of a military dictator, which was Napoleon Bonaparte. And the person you can see on the right is the infamous Napoleon Bonaparte. Moving on to our last subtopic for the day, the revolution, everyday life, how exactly this French Revolution had an impact on the everyday life of the citizens, and then the conclusion, how the French Revolution ended. Okay, so moving on to how the revolution had an impact on the everyday life of the citizens. The years following 1789 in France saw a lot of change in terms of the clothes that people wore, the languages they spoke, the books they read, and just in general the lives of all men, women, and children. So one important law that, please keep this law in mind, is extremely important, that came into effect as soon as the storming of the Bastille happened, was the abolition of censorship. So now the Declaration of the Rights of the Man and Citizen also proclaimed the freedom of speech and expression to be a natural right. Newspapers, pamphlets, books, and printed pictures flooded the towns of France, from where they traveled rapidly into the countryside as well. They all described and discussed the events and changes taking place in France. Plays, songs, and festive processions all happened with a large number of people, and this was one way that the members of the society could grasp and identify with ideas such as liberty or justice that political philosophers wrote about in their books, all of them, that only a handful of educated people could read. Now we're on the last slide for this chapter, the conclusion. In 1804, Napoleon Bonaparte, who was a dictator, crowned himself as the Emperor of France. He saw himself essentially as a modernizer of Europe. He introduced many laws. To be honest, all his laws had pretty much a very good effect on the administration system of France. So, a few of the laws that he introduced were the protection of private property and a uniform system of weights and measures provided by the decimal system. Initially, many saw Napoleon as a liberator who would bring freedom for the people. However, as time passed, the Napoleonic armies also came to be viewed as an invading force simply because Napoleon set out to conquer all neighboring European countries, dispossessing dynasties and creating kingdoms where he placed his own members of like his family in the kingdom. And a lot of countries were against this. And finally, he was defeated at Waterloo in 1815. Again, very important. The place, Waterloo, as well as the date 1815 is very important. Keep that in mind. Now, to conclude, what the French Revolution achieved and what it finally brought about in the people of France was the ideas of liberty and democratic rights were the most important legacy of the French Revolution. These spread from France to the rest of Europe during the 19th century, where feudal systems did exist, and all of this was now finally abolished in a lot of countries as well. And for example, even in India, this French Revolution had a very major effect. Tipu Sultan and Ram Mohan Roy are two examples of individuals who responded to the ideas coming from the revolutionary France and to the ideas of the French Revolution. So that's it for this chapter. It is a pretty long chapter, but it's very interesting. History for grade 9 in general is actually very interesting. And there are a lot of interesting chapters to come, like the Russian Revolution and especially Nazism. So make sure to check out our future videos where we will be discussing such chapters. For now, make sure to subscribe, like, comment on this video, and share this video with as many people as possible, because in Level Up, our aim is to impart knowledge to as many people as possible. Because during this corona pandemic, there are a lot of people who don't have the access to education or the right education or quality education in general. And we want to be able to impart knowledge to as many people as possible. So even more important than subscribing and liking this video is to share this video with as many people as possible. So make sure you do that and comment what video you want next. Make sure to hear from us and stay in touch.